The day I refused to lie. The email that ended my career. The day they fired me, it was raining in Chicago. Not the gentle kind. The kind that hits the windows like accusation. I was standing in a glass conference room on the 47th floor of Harlow and Pierce Financial, staring at three men in $1,000 suits asking me to destroy evidence. Just adjust the projections, my boss, Richard Latham, said calmly. Investors don't need the full picture. The full picture was this. The company was bleeding money, and they were hiding it. You want me to lie, I whispered. Richard didn't blink. I want you to be loyal. My stomach twisted. I'd spent 8 years building my career in that company. Late nights. Missed holidays. Promotions earned, not given. I won't do it. The silence that followed felt like a guillotine blade, suspended in air. An hour later, HR handed me a termination letter citing performance concerns. Performance. As I packed my office overlooking Lake Michigan, I realized something that hurt more than losing my job. They weren't just firing me. They were erasing me. But what they didn't know, I had already forwarded the real financial reports to my personal encrypted drive. And I wasn't done. Before I continue, please subscribe to my channel to see more interesting stories. Thank you. The Whisper Campaign. By the time I landed in Denver to stay with my sister, my reputation was already in ashes. No one wants to touch you, a recruiter told me over the phone. There are concerns. Concerns. That was corporate code for blacklisted. Richard hadn't just fired me. He had buried me. Former colleagues stopped answering my texts. My LinkedIn endorsements vanished overnight. Someone had labeled me difficult. I lay awake in my sister's guest room, staring at the ceiling, replaying that conference room moment. What if I had just edited the numbers? I would still have my office,
my salary,
my life. But then I remembered the investors, the pension funds, the employees who trusted the company's stability. The lie would have ruined thousands. And that's when anger replaced grief. I opened my laptop. The real financial projections glowed on my screen like a loaded weapon. Projected losses hidden through shell vendors in Phoenix. Inflated asset values tied to a real estate project in Miami. Suspicious transfers routed through Nevada. This wasn't just accounting manipulation. This was fraud. And I was the only one outside that building who had proof. The offer. 3 weeks later, I received a call from an unknown Washington, D.C. number. Miss Hall? This is Special Agent Carla Ruiz with the Securities and Exchange Commission. My heart stopped. We'd like to speak with you regarding Harlow and Pierce. The room went silent around me. Someone had already tipped them off. We met in a quiet federal building downtown Denver. Fluorescent lights.
No quorums. No comfort.
Agent Ruiz slid a file across the table. We've been monitoring irregularities for months, she said. But we lacked internal documentation. I hesitated. If I gave them everything, there would be no going back. You'd be protected under whistleblower statutes, she continued carefully. Protected. That word sounded fragile. Still, I handed over the encrypted drive. As she opened the files, her expression shifted from calm to alert. This, she whispered, is bigger than we thought. I walked out into the Colorado sunlight feeling something unfamiliar. Not fear. Power. But I had no idea how vicious Richard would become once he realized I'd moved first. The counterattack. It started with a lawsuit. Defamation. Breach of confidentiality. Theft of proprietary information. Harlow and Pierce filed it in New York federal court. They were trying to bankrupt me. News articles began circulating, painting me as a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge. The irony was suffocating. I wasn't trying to destroy them. I was trying to stop them from destroying others. One night, I received a private message from an anonymous account. You don't know how deep this goes. Be careful. I froze. The next morning, Agent Ruiz called. They're moving money, she said, rapidly. To offshore accounts. They were preparing for impact. And that's when I realized something terrifying. They weren't just hiding numbers. They were planning an exit. The collapse begins. It happened on a Tuesday morning. I was making coffee when CNBC flashed breaking news. Federal investigation launched into Harlow and Pierce Financial. My hands trembled. Trading halted. Stock plummeting. Headquarters swarmed by federal agents in Chicago. I watched live footage of employees being escorted out. Richard appeared briefly outside the building, jaw tight, refusing to answer questions. For a moment, I felt vindicated.
But then my phone rang.
Unknown number. I answered cautiously. It was him. Annie, Richard said, voice no longer calm. You've made your point. I said nothing. You know the company will collapse without you. Thousands will lose their jobs. There it was. The manipulation. You could fix this, he added quietly. I looked at the television, watching agents carry boxes of evidence out of the building I once called home.
No, Iraplia.
I'm not your scapegoat anymore. I hung up. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Because if the company fell completely, the fallout would hurt more than just Richard. And soon, they would come back with an offer I never expected. The Insider. 2 nights after Richard's call, I received another message. Not anonymous this time. Daniel Kim, Senior Risk Analyst. Chicago office. My pulse quickened. Daniel had always been quiet.
Brilliant.
Invisible in meetings. The kind of man who saw everything and said nothing.
Until now.
We scheduled a secure video call. He looked thinner. Nervous. They're shredding internal emails, he whispered. And they're blaming you for triggering a panic. Of course they were. But that's not the worst part, he added. He turned his camera and showed me scanned contracts, side agreements with shell corporations in Phoenix and Las Vegas. Fake consulting firms siphoning investor funds. This wasn't just about hiding losses, Daniel said. They've been moving retirement funds into high-risk offshore projects tied to board members. My stomach dropped. Retirement funds.
Teachers.
Firefighters. Nurses. This wasn't corporate greed. It was theft from everyday Americans. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Daniel hesitated. Because they're planning to make you the criminal mastermind. Silence swallowed the room. They're preparing documents that show you authorized everything. I felt the air leave my lungs. They weren't just fighting back. They were preparing to sacrifice me. The trap. 3 days later, I was served. A criminal referral filed by Harlow and Pierce's legal team, alleging I had manipulated financial models before my termination. They were building a narrative. An ambitious executive gone rogue. I drove to Washington, D.C. and met Agent Ruiz in person. She listened carefully, then leaned back. They're desperate, she said. Which means they're scared. I handed her Daniel's documents. She read for nearly 10 minutes, without speaking. This changes everything, she murmured. But they're framing me, I said. They're manufacturing evidence. She nodded slowly. Then we let them. I blinked. Excuse me? If they submit falsified documents to federal investigators, she explained, that's obstruction of justice. That's prison. For the first time, I saw the strategy. Let them overreach. Let them lie. Because, unlike them, I wasn't afraid of the truth. Still, that night in my D.C. hotel room, I couldn't sleep. Because desperate men with millions on the line don't just lie. They eliminate threats. The break-in. It happened in Denver. I returned to my sister's house late, after dinner with Ruiz. The front door was slightly ajar. Every nerve in my body screamed. Inside, drawers were pulled open. Papers scattered. My laptop bag was gone. They hadn't taken jewelry. Or electronics. Just my work files. My sister stood frozen in the kitchen. They said they were investigators, she whispered. They showed badges. Fake badges. I stepped outside and called Ruiz immediately. Within hours, real federal agents were inside the house. They're looking for leverage, Ruiz said. Or intimidation. The violation cut deeper than fear. They had entered my life. My family's home. That night, as I sat on the floor surrounded by overturned furniture, something inside me shifted. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was going to dismantle them completely. And the next morning, the biggest twist yet exploded across every news channel in America. The arrest. Richard Latham was arrested at O'Hare International Airport. He was attempting to board a flight to Zurich. The image of him in handcuffs flooded social media within minutes. Fraud. Securities violations. Attempted obstruction. I watched from a quiet cafe in Washington. People gasped at the television. "That's the CEO of Harlow and Pierce," someone said.
Yes.
The untouchable king had fallen. But victory didn't feel the way I imagined. Because by noon, the company issued a public statement. They claimed Richard had acted alone. A rogue executive. The board had no knowledge of misconduct. And then came the twist that made my blood run cold. They announced an internal restructuring and a new interim leadership team. One of the names listed? Board Chairman William Carlisle. The same man who approved every suspicious transfer Daniel had uncovered. They were cutting off the head
To save the body.
and that body was still infected. The offer. I didn't expect the call. It came from a private New York number. "Miss Hall," the voice said smoothly. "This is William Carlisle, the chairman. I believe we got off on the wrong foot." I almost laughed. He continued, "The board recognizes your integrity. We'd like to discuss reinstating you." Reinstating me? After lawsuits? Smear campaigns?
Break-ins.
"You need credibility," I said calmly.
He didn't deny it.
"Our investors trust you," he admitted. "If you return as chief compliance officer, it would signal stability." Stability. They wanted my reputation to save their collapsing empire. "And what happens to the investigation?" I asked. "That depends," he replied carefully, "on how cooperative everyone is." There it was. A deal. Come back. Quiet things down. Help them survive. In exchange for what? Power?
Redemption?
Or another betrayal? I stared out at the Washington skyline, heart pounding. For the first time since this began, I wasn't reacting. I was being invited back inside the lion's den. And this time, I could choose how it burned. Walking back into the fire. I said yes. But not the way William Carlisle expected. Before stepping back into Harlow and Pierce's Chicago headquarters, I signed a confidential cooperation agreement with the SEC and the Department of Justice. I wasn't returning as their savior. I was returning as bait. Federal protection was discreet.
No dramatic bodyguards.
Just silent surveillance and a burner phone that connected directly to Agent Ruiz. When I walked back into the glass tower overlooking Lake Michigan, conversation stopped. Some people looked relieved. Others looked terrified. William greeted me in the executive lobby with a politician's smile.
"Annie.
"We're grateful. Grateful." I took in the marble floors, the company logo gleaming like nothing had happened. "You'll have full authority over compliance," he said smoothly. "Access to everything."
Perfect.
That was exactly what I needed. As I stepped into my new office, bigger than the one they took from me, I felt the weight of irony. They thought I was there to stabilize investors. But I was there to document every lie still breathing inside those walls. And by the end of my first day back, I realized Richard hadn't been the mastermind. He had been the distraction, the hidden ledger. It was buried deep in the server architecture. A restricted financial ledger labeled Project Horizon, accessed only by 3 board members. William Carlisle was one of them. I worked late into the night, pretending to review compliance policies while quietly downloading mirrored data onto a secure federal drive. Project Horizon wasn't about saving the company. It was about transferring liquid assets into private equity firms registered in Delaware and offshore entities in the Cayman Islands. If the company collapsed, the board would walk away wealthy. Employees and investors would be left with ashes. They hadn't been scrambling. They had been planning an escape. My office phone rang at 11:47 p.m., burning the midnight oil. William's voice drifted through the receiver. "I take this role seriously," I replied. A pause. "You've always been ambitious, Annie. Just remember who gave you this opportunity."
Opportunity.
I stared at the numbers on my screen. Millions redirected weeks before Richard's arrest. "You didn't give me anything," I whispered after hanging up. You underestimated me. But the next morning, someone confronted me in the parking garage. And it wasn't who I expected. Daniel's confession. Daniel stood beside my car, eyes red, hands shaking. They know, he said. My heart slammed against my ribs. Know what? That I sent you the contracts. Cold air filled my lungs.
How?
They traced access logs. IT is auditing everything. He looked terrified. I have a family, Annie. Guilt sliced through me. I never wanted you exposed. I don't regret helping you, he said quickly. But there's more. He handed me a flash drive. This isn't about money laundering alone. There are political donations tied to Project Horizon. I froze. How high does this go? Daniel swallowed. Higher than Chicago. If board members were funneling corporate funds into political campaigns in exchange for regulatory protection, this wasn't just financial crime. It was corruption at a federal level. As Daniel walked away, I realized something devastating. By coming back inside, I hadn't just stepped into corporate warfare. I had stepped into something that could shake Washington itself. And powerful people don't fall quietly. The leak. The first news article dropped on a Friday night. Whistleblower returns to guide corporate reform. My face was everywhere. They were rebranding me as the hero of their recovery. I hadn't authorized any press. William had. It was strategic. If the public saw me as part of the company again, it diluted the narrative that leadership was corrupt. I called him immediately. You used me, I said. We're rebuilding trust, he replied calmly. And you're the perfect symbol.
Symbol.
Not partner. Not executive. Propaganda. That same night, Agent Ruiz called. They're trying to protect the stock price before we freeze additional accounts, she explained.
So, what do we do?
I asked. Her voice sharpened. We accelerate. The plan shifted. Instead of building a slow case, federal prosecutors would move fast, coordinated raids, synchronized subpoenas. But timing was critical. We needed undeniable proof tying the board to Project Horizon. And that proof was locked in a private board meeting scheduled in New York. A meeting I had just been invited to attend. The recording. The boardroom in Manhattan was colder than Chicago's. Glass walls. Manhattan's skyline glittering behind them like a silent witness. William chaired the meeting. The topic: strategic asset preservation. Translation: survival. As they spoke openly, believing I was now loyal, they revealed everything. Plans to declare controlled bankruptcy. Asset transfers finalized. Legal strategies to distance themselves from Richard. One board member laughed. By the time regulators catch up, we'll be retired. My pulse thundered in my ears. Inside my blazer, the federal recording device captured every word, every admission, every arrogant confession. William leaned toward me. You understand why we had to let Richard take the fall, don't you? There it was. Confirmation. They had sacrificed him deliberately. I forced a neutral expression. I understand, I said carefully. But inside, something burned. They thought they were untouchable. As the meeting ended, I walked out onto Fifth Avenue, breathing in cold New York air. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I knew the end was near. Because now I didn't just have numbers. I had their voices. And voices are harder to bury than spreadsheets. The morning the doors locked. It happened at 6:12 a.m. Chicago was barely awake when federal agents entered Harlow and Pierce's headquarters. This time it wasn't quiet. Search warrants. Asset freezes. Simultaneous raids in New York, Phoenix, Miami, and Washington, D.C. I stood in my office as employees gathered near the windows, watching black SUVs line the street below. My phone vibrated. Agent Ruiz. It's moving, she said. Bank accounts frozen. Board members notified. William stormed into my office minutes later. You knew, he hissed. I didn't answer. His polished calm was gone, replaced with panic. You think this saves you? He snapped. I held his gaze steadily. I think the truth saves everyone else. Within the hour, trading was suspended indefinitely. News helicopters hovered above the building like vultures. But in the chaos, I saw something that hurt more than anything. Junior employees crying at their desks. Assistants terrified about mortgages. They hadn't committed crimes. They were collateral damage. And that realization planted a seed inside me. Justice was necessary. But destruction? That was something I needed to control. The betrayal I didn't see. Daniel didn't answer his phone. Not that morning. Not that afternoon. By evening, I received the call. He's been detained, Agent Ruiz said quietly. For what? My voice broke. Internal surveillance flagged unauthorized data transfers. The board's attorneys moved quickly. My chest tightened. He helped expose corruption, I said. And that's why they're trying to make him the fall guy. Rage pulsed through me. I had convinced Daniel to trust the system. And now he was paying for it. That night, I drove alone along Lakeshore Drive, the city lights blurring through my tears. Had I dragged him into this? Had my return accelerated everything too quickly? Then Ruiz sent me something that changed everything. A transcript. Daniel had refused to incriminate me, even under pressure. They threatened his family, Ruiz said. He didn't fold. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. This wasn't just about corporate fraud anymore. This was about protecting the innocent. And I made a decision that would shock everyone, including the federal prosecutors.
The choice.
I requested a private meeting with the U.S. attorney in Washington. They expected celebration. Instead, I gave them a condition. I'll testify publicly, I said. But Daniel receives immunity. The prosecutor hesitated. He was involved. He was coerced, I replied. And he provided critical evidence. Silence filled the room. This case is stronger with you alone, he said carefully.
No, y ensured firmly.
This case is stronger with integrity. I wasn't going to let another innocent person be sacrificed the way Richard had been used by the board. After hours of negotiation, they agreed. Daniel would receive reduced liability in exchange for full cooperation. When I told him, his voice cracked. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I said softly. I did. Because justice without compassion becomes revenge. And I wasn't trying to become them. But the board wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The final gambit. William Carlisle held a press conference in Manhattan. He denied everything, claimed federal overreach, painted himself as a victim of corporate politics. And then he did something reckless. He accused me publicly. Ms. Hall manipulated internal systems after her reinstatement, he declared. She orchestrated chaos. I watched the broadcast from a secure room in Chicago. Agent Ruiz didn't look worried. He just sealed it, she said.
How?
She slid a document toward me. The recorded Fifth Avenue meeting transcript had been approved for court submission. William's voice.
Clear.
Undeniable. Admitting to sacrificing Richard. Admitting to asset transfers. By accusing me publicly, he opened the door for immediate release of the evidence. He thought he was attacking. He had just detonated his own defense. And the next 48 hours would become the most watched corporate trial in a decade. The testimony. The courtroom in New York felt colder than any boardroom. Cameras lined the entrance. Reporters everywhere. When I took the stand, I felt 8 years of silence pressing against my chest. The prosecutor asked the first question. Why did you refuse to alter the financial projections? I swallowed. Because they weren't numbers, I said. They were people's futures. The room stilled. I described the pressure. The firing. The smear campaign. The break-in. Then they played the recording. William's voice echoed through the courtroom. We had to let Richard take the fall.
Gasps.
The jury watched him carefully. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel fear. I felt release. When I stepped down from the stand, I locked eyes with William. He no longer looked powerful. He looked small. But as powerful as that moment was, the verdict hadn't been delivered yet. And the most significant payoff, the one that would define everything, was still coming. The verdict. The courtroom was silent enough to hear someone breathe. I stood beside Daniel as the jury filed in. William Carlisle sat stiffly at the defense table, the same man who once controlled billions now reduced to adjusting a borrowed tie. On the charge of securities fraud.
Pause.
Guilty. A ripple moved through the room. On the charge of conspiracy to commit financial fraud. Guilty. By the third count, William's shoulders had collapsed inward. Other board members followed. Guilty on multiple counts. Asset forfeiture. Federal prison. The judge didn't mince words during sentencing. You treated retirement funds like poker chips, she said. Your greed destabilized thousands of lives. Prison terms ranged from 8 to 15 years. Outside the courthouse in Manhattan, reporters swarmed me. Ms. Hall, do you feel vindicated? Vindicated? I looked up at the gray New York sky. No, I said. I feel relieved, because this had never been about revenge. It had been about stopping the bleeding. But the company was still in ruins, and thousands of employees were still waiting to learn if they had jobs. That decision
Was now somehow in my hands.
the proposal. 2 weeks later, I was summoned to Washington. Not by prosecutors, by the Treasury Department. Harlow and Pierce was on the brink of total liquidation. But regulators feared a ripple effect across pension funds and municipal bonds nationwide. They needed restructuring, stability, leadership without corruption. We want you to take over as interim CEO during federal oversight, a Treasury official said. The irony nearly made me laugh. The woman they fired for integrity, now being asked to save what remained. I won't protect executives, I said immediately. You won't, he assured me. You'll protect employees and investors. I asked for conditions. Full transparency. Public audits. Executive salary caps. Restitution funds prioritized over shareholder dividends. They agreed. When I returned to Chicago and stood in front of hundreds of anxious employees in the company atrium, I didn't give a polished speech. I won't promise comfort, I said, but I promise honesty. Some people cried, because honesty had been absent from this building for too long. And rebuilding trust is harder than exposing lies. Rebuilding the ashes. The first 6 months were brutal. We closed corrupt subsidiaries in Phoenix and Miami, recovered offshore funds from the Cayman accounts, liquidated board-owned shell firms. Every recovered dollar went into a restitution fund for pension holders. I cut executive bonuses to zero, redirected millions into employee retention programs. Some investors sued. They wanted faster profits. I didn't budge. This company almost collapsed because of greed. I told the board-appointed oversight committee. It will not repeat itself under my watch. Stock prices didn't skyrocket. But something else happened. Public trust slowly returned.
Municipal contracts renewed.
Teachers and firefighters received restitution payments. One afternoon, an elderly couple approached me outside the Chicago office. Our retirement fund was tied to your company, the woman said, squeezing my hands. Thank you. That moment meant more than any promotion ever had. But closure wasn't complete, because I still hadn't faced Richard Latham. The prison visit. Richard requested to see me. Curiosity won. The federal facility in Pennsylvania was quieter than I expected. He looked older.
Smaller.
I never meant for it to go that far, he said through the glass. You signed the orders, I replied calmly. I thought the board would protect me. There it was. The truth. He hadn't been evil. He had been weak. I was loyal to the wrong people, he admitted. I studied him for a long moment. They were never loyal to you, I said. He gave a sad smile. And you were. That hurt more than anger. Because once upon a time, I had believed in him. As I stood to leave, he said one final thing. You're doing what I should have done.
No excuses. No manipulation.
Just regret. And somehow, that felt like the final knot unraveling. The day the truth won. 1 year later, I stood once again on the 47th floor overlooking Lake Michigan. But this time it was my office. Not because I fought for power, but because I refused to lie. Harlow and Pierce wasn't the empire it once was. It was smaller, leaner, transparent. Executive compensation was public record. Compliance reports were mandatory and independent. We instituted whistleblower protections stronger than federal requirements. And every new hire hears the story of the day a financial projection wasn't altered. The day integrity cost someone everything and saved everyone else. Sometimes I think about that rainy afternoon when they fired me. If I had edited those numbers, I would still have my old life. But thousands of families would have lost theirs. Revenge would have been watching the company burn. Justice was rebuilding it without corruption. The most significant payoff wasn't prison sentences. It wasn't the CEO title. It was this. They tried to silence me. Instead, the truth gave me a voice louder than their empire. And that voice will never lie again. Thank you for listening to my story. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share my videos. Thank you.